welcome Nathan as well.
Thank you very, very much. Great, great pleasure to be here. Thank you. And what a fantastic band of musicians you have and singers.
Whatever feeds your soul, whatever makes you whole, whatever makes you feel, whatever makes you heal, whatever makes you sure, whatever makes you pure, whatever makes you sing, do that thing, just do it. Get out of your head and into your body, out of your head and just do it. Get out of your head and into your body. We don't need to conform every deal. We don't need what's new. What we need is to let ourselves be free. What we need is you, yeah. Celebrate that thing you do. Whatever feeds your soul, whatever makes you whole, whatever makes you feel, whatever makes you heal, whatever makes you sure, whatever makes you pure, whatever makes you sing, do that thing. Animate, energize, stimulate, go to it, vitalize, activate, galvanize, just do it, bring it down. Listen up for a minute, stop your hurrying. What you gonna get with all that worrying? So much to remember, so much to forget. It's gonna kill you if you undead, yet to find a way to unwind, clear your mind. There'll never be a better place and time, because now is all we have and all there is. So just do it. Do that thing. James, come on, do that thing. Whatever feeds your soul, whatever makes you whole, whatever makes you feel, whatever makes you heal, whatever makes you sure, whatever makes you pure, whatever makes you sing, do that thing, just do what you will, but harm none. Just got to remember the golden rule, which is do what you will, but harm none. And let kindness be your fuel, whatever feeds your soul, whatever makes you whole, whatever makes you feel, whatever makes you heal, whatever makes you sure, whatever makes you pure, whatever makes you sing, do that thing.
Thank you, Deb. After the first service, a woman came up to me and said, I can't believe you're so honest for a minister. And I said, I'm not sure what you mean by that. But she said, well, you just said things I've just never heard ministers say before. And I said, well, especially after I get an introduction that talks about 2 graduate degrees and a PhD, if I don't bring real life into all of this intellectualism, it's just a bunch of BS. So, yes, let's be honest. Spirituality of Desire is the title of this talk, and I don't like titles of talks because it makes it sound like I know what I'm talking about, or it makes you think you know what you're going to hear. I'm putting spirituality with desire because over the last many years, I have found myself wrestling with both of those things. What is spirituality, and how do you connect it to desire? And I mean the broadest definition of desire, those urges, those compulsions, those things that move us to want things. Aristotle called them appetites, right? Those appetites. An appetite is not something you choose. It chooses you. You ever had the experience of being chosen by your appetite? Many of us know that feeling about 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. You already had dinner. But the appetite says you need something. Chips, cake, pie, ice cream, something. That's an appetite. They're called passions because they're passive. They're not active. Active means something I do, something I decide, whereas a passion is something that decides you. They're called passionate appetites. So I'm talking here about those desires, not the desires we're happy with. That's great. That's another talk. I'm focusing, and this afternoon we're going to go into it in much more detail from a Jungian depth psychological perspective, looking at how instincts can be transmuted. But I'm looking at those desires that are annoying. Any of you have any of those? That's all? I'm talking about those desires, and there's a very, very dark side to this. Someone after the first talk also came up to me and said, she works for law enforcement, and she comes across some people who have some pretty horrible desires when it comes to victimizing other people. So we're looking at those sorts of things, and she said, I'm not sure how to fit that in with a spiritual paradigm. That's what we're looking at. This is not an answer. This is an exploration. Our group over on Bainbridge Island, we don't really have a church service. We've sort of morphed it into a conversation. I will come with a lesson like this, but we will engage in a dialogue as we go along. So we'll do more of that this afternoon if you decide to join us. So what about this thing, spirituality of desire? First of all, let's start with the word desire. Most people trace it back to the root desidere. De, Latin for of or from, sedere, stars. So desire, many think, comes from the idea of that which comes from the stars. And for this day and age, that doesn't make much sense because we have been taught that the stars are these inanimate objects that sort of are in the sky made of these sort of, inanimate particles, and they just shine brightly as, galaxies and all that sort of thing. But in the ancient world, when they looked up in the sky, they saw these luminous beings, and then they saw a few planets. We call them planets now. The Greeks called them planao, which is the Greek word for wanderer. So they would see some of them actually wandering, moving through the sky as if they had a will of their own. So they had this view, it's even in the Hebrew Bible, that the hosts of the heaven are angels. So these bright stars were angelic or some sort of supernatural beings lighting up the sky. And many groups, starting with the Babylonians, the Egyptians had this idea, the Greeks had it, the Romans had this idea that the human soul made a journey from way, way up in the ethers, and each soul, that would be each of us in this room, comes down and we pass through the stars or the planets. And each of the planets has a little bit of desire, and each planet has its own desires. And it gives each soul its own little ingredient from each of the planets, so that by the time each of us gets here, we're a sort of concoction of different desires from the different stars, desidere, from the stars. So each of us comes into this world as a unique being with our own little admixture of desires. And you know that's true. You talk to one person about your desires, and they'll look at you like, right? And then they'll talk about their desires. I'm in recovery, so I talk to people sometimes about my recovery from alcohol addiction, and people who have no problem with it typically will say to me, well, why didn't you just stop drinking? I said, no, I'm not going to say this. Never mind what I said. But I tell them that it's not as easy. I try to find something that they struggle with as a desire that they can't just stop automatically. That's what we're talking about, from the stars. Now, the ancient idea, or at least one of them, was this. And John Keats, by the way, the poet, the 19th century romantic poet, kind of developed this idea in one of his letters. The ancients had this idea that there wasn't a God necessarily that created us whole and put us on this earth, but that each of us comes into this world through the womb with this little mixture of desires, the raw material, if you will, and that we come out into this world, and this world actually becomes a second womb. So that each of us is a little soul with desires in it that has to grow in this second womb, just as the body grew in the first womb. Joseph Campbell calls it a womb with a view. So we come into this world, and we're gestating. I mean, this is the notion that our souls are gestating in this world, and that these little soul embryos, each of us has these different desires in us, and we begin to discover them as we grow up. You know what I'm talking about? How certain kids gravitate towards certain toys, or certain playmates, or certain ideas. And we gravitate because we have these in us when we come to earth, and they're the raw material. The alchemists worked with this idea. The alchemists worked not only with metals, turning base metals like lead into gold to find the philosopher's stone. The alchemists also had the idea that each of our souls have these sort of base desires in them. Base, I mean basic desires, and that this life and our experiences in this life transmuted these desires from being these little base desires into eventually golden desires, transmuted through what? How are we transmuted? How did these desires get transmuted in us? Through life. Through sitting in a service like this, listening to a blabbermouth like me stand up here and talk. Each of you is having experiences with that. The people you marry, the school you went to, all the experiences you go through, you encounter these experiences, and you notice that little appetites begin to spring up, or desires to say things or to do things that, where did that come from? The ancients said it came from the stars, and each one of us comes to this world in order to develop these raw desires into some sort of transmuted spiritual desire. So what value does that give to your desires? What would you say? What value does that give to your basic desires? A lot. And the idea here is that when the ancients would say the gods or God is in everything, they really meant it. Because every desire, negative or positive, comes from the gods. And every desire had a negative and a positive side to it. I'll give you an example. My own life, I talked about the alcohol addiction. You can pick any addiction you want. When you're in the middle of a desire or an appetite that is kicking your butt, you know what I'm talking about? It's kicking your butt to the point that you feel like you're being completely destroyed by it. The alchemists would say, or the ancients would say, that that's exactly what's happening. There is something in you that's dying. And if you stay in the process and find the God in it, then you will transmute. People in recovery will often talk about hitting bottom, and then when they move through that experience of transmutation, that thing that almost kills them, sometimes does, that they speak about coming out the other side, that is through the doorway, the hinge of that desire, they come out the other side, and that thing which once killed them has now given them life, a life they would have never dreamed. When I first got involved in recovery several years ago, I remember those early meetings hearing people say, I'm a grateful alcoholic. And I remember sitting there, thank you, that was my response too. I remember sitting there thinking, that's the stupidest thing you could ever imagine, because when I was there many years ago, I found myself sitting there, I'd literally lost everything. I mean, I was one of those people that lost everything. And I found myself saying, how can you be grateful? I started to understand. Because by being broken down having that base desire break me down, and you don't have to go down as far as some people do. Have it broke me down so that I could be rebuilt in a way that I would have never been rebuilt as a result of having gone through that. Others of you understand what I'm talking about here? So that's what we're talking about, the transmutation of desire. I want to skip, for our PowerPoint presentation, skip the first slide and go to the second, if I could. There we go. Thank you. This is Hafiz, the Persian poet, saying exactly what I'm just said to you here. He said, every desire of your body is holy. Now, does that mean that it shows up holy the minute it comes out of my body? No, this is a very different perspective. And that's what the person who asked me after the second service about, crimes and certain acts of desire that are very, very destructive. I am not up here saying that every act of desire is holy in the sense that it is orderly and purposefully good in the moment. But this perspective suggests that those things, and this is what I'm focusing on, those things that we're struggling with, you hear that? Those things you are struggling with, those things I am struggling with, I'm either going to see them as separate from my spiritual life, you understand? Or I'm going to be able to incorporate them into a holistic view that says this thing that seems like it's killing me in my body has within it the cure. Next slide, please, the one by Rumi. Rumi says it like this: longing is the core of mystery. Longing itself brings what? The cure. So the idea here is that the very thing, Carl Jung said it like this, he says, within every disease there is a God. See, this is not your traditional sense of God is sort of, up in the sky, passing out blessings or curses. This is the idea that those things that come through us and that are in us, especially those things we are ashamed of because they're the most important, those things have in them the potential to bring huge cures. Our desire contains the cure. Say, well, that's fine and dandy. But what about right now while it's killing me? Right? That's why you need to come to the workshop this afternoon. Seriously, because in the workshop we will have time to look at this in more detail. But let me just say very, very briefly for this service here that the theory of transmutation, spiritual transmutation, looks like this. I live through these experiences and I learn as I live through them. And if I live as I live through them and move through them, if I am calling on the infinite, which is in the desire, the infinite works with me through the desire to transmute it into something wholly other. Let me give you some examples. There's not one great spiritual teacher that you will ever meet who has not gone through this experience of being on this side of the desire where it's killing them, and then moving through the hinge door or through the portal of the other side where the desire has been transmuted. It always works that way. Let's take Buddha. Siddhartha, prince in a palace, has everything he needs, everything he wants. If you're familiar with the life of the Buddha, Siddhartha has everything he needs in this palace. He has pleasure, he has food, he has sex, he has everything. His father's a great general and a great leader, and he has a vast army. And Siddhartha's going to grow up and inherit all of this. He has it all. And then he goes outside the palace, and we read that he saw all these things going on in the world, death, disease, etc. And he comes back and he looks at his life and he says, there's something more. There's something more. And by the way, the alchemist said we have desires because the desires drive us to find more. Desire always says more. 8 o'clock at night. You've eaten. You don't need any more. But the voice says, more. And one side of you says, no. But the passion says, yes. And you follow the instinct or the passion. So every one of these great teachers, the Buddha he lived by his instincts, right? His appetites, until he decided to leave the palace. He left the palace and he faced his appetites. He went to 2 different meditation teachers. And they taught him how to go within and how to go deep and how to find these dark desires and all of the different things that he found within his own consciousness. And both of those teachers, after he finished their courses, they said to him, will you stay and teach for us? And you know what he said? No, because I haven't found what I'm looking for. This is a very individual path. This is another reason what I'm talking about up here this morning is so difficult. Because each one of us has to go through our own process with these struggles, these desires. No two people are going to get the same answer. I think it was Gary was sharing in one of our classes that the problem with self-help books is somebody else wrote them. Right? Because it's somebody else's process. So the Buddha had two self-help books, so to speak, two teachers that taught him how to meditate. But he said, you haven't given me what I need to get through my own transmutation process to find enlightenment. So he goes and he sits under a Bodhi tree, very famous story. And he sits there and he says, I will not move from this spot until I see the truth. And we read that he goes through, what happens under that Bodhi tree? 3 temptations, 3 tests. Now, let me just say as a subtext to this, you find the same thing in the New Testament with Jesus Christ, right? Jesus Christ lives the first 30 years of his life. We don't know much about it, but before he transitions into his enlightenment and his ministry, he goes through 3 temptations. You find it in Pan's Labyrinth, the movie. You find it in The Wizard of Oz. You find it in Psyche Cupid, or the Psyche Eros story in Greece. You find this everywhere. Every single great story. You find it in Star Wars. You find it in Harry Potter. Every single great teacher goes from being an ordinary person with ordinary appetites and desires, and then they move through a transition period where those desires are faced and transmuted, and then they move into a place of being their ministry, if you will, the place of their purposeful greatness. Well, the Buddha is under the Bodhi tree, and he's meditating, and all of a sudden, what shows up in front of him in his first temptations? Anybody remember? No? I expect this from the Bible, but from Buddha, geez. What's his first temptation? Beautiful maidens, thank you. Beautiful dancing girls show up, dancing in front of him. I mean, this is, before the internet. I mean, he had his own internet. So he sees this in this meditation. Now, I want you to go with me here, and this is before they are spiritual giants. So here they are ordinary human beings. So this temptation was actually a temptation, or it wouldn't be called a temptation. So my suspicion is that he was having a flashback to the old palace days, when all he had to do was room service, and he got whatever he wanted. You fill in the blanks. So here he is seeing these beautiful dancing girls dancing in front of him, and this is that moment at 8 o'clock at night where the chocolate cake says, come and eat me. Take me. I'm yours. This is Buddha's chocolate cake moment. And in this moment, and this is not saying when you will have this moment, because none of us knows this, but you need to stay in the process. This is why we stay in the spiritual process, because those things that are kicking our rear ends the most are the gateways into the enlightenment or the whatever it is we're looking for. The God is in that moment. So the Buddha is sitting there and he sees this vision and he knows what it had to be tempting to him or it wouldn't have showed up as a temptation. But he had had enough experiences of chocolate cake to know this is not the answer. You know what I'm talking about? How many of you out there have gotten to that point where your life changed when you realized the food wasn't the answer? How many? Let's see. All right. Thank you. So he got it. This was a moment of transmutation. The base appetite, the raw desire of the holiness of the infinite was suddenly transmuted from lead into gold in that moment. When does that moment take place? Can't answer it for you. But I do know that it will not take place unless you stay in the process. All too often, I think we gauge our spirituality by saying, oh, I'm having too many problems to be spiritual. Right? Well, if I were spiritual, I wouldn't be having this temptation. And I've met people who quit going to church, a really, really good church. They quit going because they said, by now I should be spiritual. You don't get spiritual by sitting in a church. You get spiritual by sitting at home at 8 o'clock at night when the chocolate cake starts talking to you. That's the spiritual moment. And I'm not telling you what to do or that if I can give you 5 answers to it. This is not about that. This is about being in the transmutational process. Even if we just take the step to, this is it. This is the spiritual moment. Then go eat the frickin' cake. I'm serious. But go eat the cake or whatever it is you do. Have the 8 glasses of wine. Not encouraging it. But if you're doing it, you're going to do it again. I know. But to take a step and say, this is it. This is where Spirit is. Spirit is working in this moment. This desire, this appetite has something very holy in it. And I'm going to eat this cake or drink this wine. But before I do, I'm going to say, Spirit, transmute this. Transmute this. I am helpless. I am passive in the face of this passion. Now, I'm speaking honestly here. This is what this woman was talking about, I think, after the service. Because she said, I've got a couple things going on in my life right now like that. She said, I've never talked about it with anybody in church. Well, why would we? We're all ashamed of those sorts of things. Do I hear an amen at least? Amen. I knew it. So here we are. The Buddha has a moment of really, this is the awakening, the transmutative moment, because it says that he just simply said, no, this is not what I'm looking for. These are the things you've tried, and 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 the more didn't fill. And there's something new. The Buddha gets it. The next temptation comes along. If you read the life of the Buddha, what's the second temptation that comes? Rosella? You remember? What? No? Anybody? An army of soldiers comes charging at him on horses. And some people say, well, it's because, they were trying to scare him. I don't think so. That's not the temptation. He came from a father who was the general of a large army, and he was going to inherit this power. By the way, Jesus' second temptation was power. Satan took him up onto a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world, and said, these are yours if you bow down to me. So the Buddha is there. Suddenly he sees these hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers on horses, in their attire. And there was this temptation to go back. I'm sitting under a frickin' Bodhi tree. Here's an army. I can conquer kingdoms. I could be the president. It wasn't his call. It is for some. It wasn't his. And so he went through this transmutive moment where I'm sure that during the other meditation periods, he had seen this army many times. He knew this temptation, that he had a father who was wealthier than anybody he knew, and that all he had to do was go back to that, and it was his. But there was that moment where he said no to the chocolate cake again. And he moves through it. And then the third temptation, or the third test comes. And this is the one that most people don't know, but to me it's one of the most powerful. The third temptation comes to the Buddha, and you know what it was, what it said? It leaned over and whispered in his ear, nobody cares. Nobody cares. Do you ever feel that way about your spiritual practices? What good's this doing? I mean, to me, this voice is the voice that just comes right after the army, and the voice says, look at you. You had it all. Now you're sitting under a frickin' Bodhi tree. And the future has nothing. You're going to go out and try to preach a message to people, and nobody cares. This is the one I wrestle with almost every Monday morning. And a lot of teachers do. You get done, and I sometimes wrestle with it when I leave the church. Sheryl knows. Sometimes I'll be driving down the road back home after a church service, and I'll just look over and I'll go, blah, blah, blah. I feel like that. It's like, blah, blah, frickin' blah. Shut up. This is what the teacher, this is what the Buddha heard from this temptation that was telling him, nobody cares. Quit. Go home. If you don't want the dancing girls, you don't want the powerful army, then at least save yourself some trouble and get off this spiritual path and go back and do something else. Sell insurance. He said, no, I will move through this. And the desire was transmuted. These are called temptations because they are the things that pull us off the path of purpose. You understand what I'm saying by that? The ancients said desire is that infinite spark and that finite being that moves that being to the infinite. You hear that? Desire is that infinite spark that keeps saying more, there's more, there's more. And without it, we would not move to the infinite. So every desire is holy. Every time, my sponsor told me, he said, Michael, every time you picked up that tequila glass and emptied it, God was calling to you from the bottom of that glass. Carl Jung, who was involved with indirectly with the founding of AA, wrote a letter back to Bill Wilson when Bill wrote him years later. And Carl Jung said, you have a choice between the spirits or spirit. Because we're always chasing spirit. But oftentimes, the thing that we think spirit is going to be found in is really just the thread that's leading us into it. The rabbis have a beautiful image. The Jewish rabbi says, God has dropped us down to this earth on a long string. And we're here, dangling, alone. And then in order to cure our boredom, we find ways to break the string. And then God ties it. And we break it, and God reties it. And we break it, and God reties it. And we break it, and God reties it. Are you getting the point? The more we break it, the more we move through this process of life, the closer we get to the source. Although most often for many of us, we think, I've broken it so many times, I'm getting further away, I'm going the wrong direction. No, you're going the right direction. Now, I want to end this by saying, I'm not asking you or telling you to go out and fulfill these annoying desires. But I am here to encourage you that the God, the Spirit, the infinite that you are seeking is right in the middle of every one of those desires. Revision the way we see them, and it will change the way we respond to them. If you want to do more of this, join us this afternoon and downstairs or over in the room upstairs. But I want to do a little quick prayer here to kind of seal this if you'd like to join me. Let's take a minute, take a breath. Take a breath. And I want you to, if you choose to, identify a particular desire right now that you'd just as soon not have. A desire that keeps coming to you and taking you to a place that you're getting tired of. And this morning in this closing prayer, I'm not going to ask you to do anything except to acknowledge it. And Hebrew style, I'm going to ask you, if you choose, to just lift your arms up in the air with your palms upward in a sign of receptivity and say, Infinite Spirit, these desires that I'm having, I don't know what to do with. I give them to you, and I leave my hands open to receive in return what you will transmute this thing into something glorious. And then I want you to receive visually, just imagine something coming, filling your hands. And now bring your palms down together, cross them and come to your chest, and put your palms on your chest and take it in. Because as Rumi says, all of these longings, all of these cravings, at their core, holds the cure. And so it is.
with these hands and with this heart, I can start to love, to love, to love, to love. I've been bruised and I've been burned. Still I yearn to love. So I'll forgive and I'll forget, pay my debt to love, to love, to love, to love. Because love is all there is. Ever was and will be. to love.